our young people in harm's way, and they have not been subjected to a draft, it is morally wrong to do that. And the Congress should be involved in that decision.
Thank you for being here. And now to today's live coverage of the House of Representatives. You have a good weekend.
Thanks for giving us another day. We thank you that you have been our help in decades past and will be our hope for years to come. We pause in your presence and ask guidance for the men and women of the People's House. Send your spirit of wisdom as they face this day with difficult decisions to be made, work to be done, burdens to be carried, and life to be lived as best they can. Keep love's banner floating over all of us as we walk in the way of those who act with justice, love with mercy, and walk with humility before you. Help us to fashion our desires, our duties, and our deeds in accordance with your will, that we may labor for a better world filled with good people who labor for the well-being of all. Bless us this day and every day, and may all that is done within the People's House this day be done for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 one-minute requests on each side. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask permission to address the House for 1 minute revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this morning's announcement of an increase in the unemployment rate indicates yet again the President's economic policies are failing American families. The out-of-control spending is killing small business job creation. Sadly, more than 14 million people are still without jobs, and the average price of gasoline is almost $4 a gallon. The President pledged to reduce unemployment to 8% and failed. He pledged to skyrocket energy costs, and he succeeded. This is a failure of leadership. On job creation and gas costs, American families are at risk. Earlier this week, the President asked Congress to increase the debt limit by $2.4 trillion with no meaningful reforms. Reforms are needed because American families need jobs, and the President's request was defeated in a bipartisan vote. House Republicans presented the Cut and Grow congressional plan. It's a common sense plan. First cut spending, then the economy will grow. That's how to create jobs. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we'll never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
House Republicans are trying to sell America's seniors a false bill of goods. Republicans claim that seniors won't be impacted by their plan to end Medicare. That simply isn't true. What's true is that insurance bureaucrats will be placed in between seniors and their doctors. What's true is that a senior in my state of California will be forced to pay $6,000 extra in out-of-pocket expenses. Then once the Republican plan to end Medicare takes full effect, those out-of-pocket expenses will double. Imagine our seniors being turned away at the pharmacy. Imagine seniors having to reach deeper into their wallet after a doctor's visit. The GOP plan to end Medicare is unacceptable. We must keep our promises to our seniors.
What purpose does the gentleman from North Dakota seek recognition? Without objection, gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commend the countless volunteers who have given time and resources in the wake of unprecedented flooding. As thousands of North Dakotans fight to protect their homes and communities, North Dakotans have come together to fill sandbags to help those in need, providing food for volunteers and shelter for those who have been displaced by flooding. This has truly been a team effort. Working together with Senator Conrad, Senator Hoeven, Governor Dalrymple, mayors, and federal officials to ensure that North Dakota receives the vital support to fight this flood and rebuild as soon as the flood's over. I commend state and local officials and the North Dakota National Guard for the tremendous work that they have done, working tirelessly to prepare for this flood and quickly responding to those who need help. And most importantly, to the tens of thousands of volunteers who embody North Dakota spirit and show times of hardship that they'll pull together and get the job done. Again, thank you for all the volunteers, and our hearts go out to those that are fighting the flood. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection. Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents are wondering when the House majority will hear their cries. Don't end Medicare. In fact, a recent CNN poll showed opposition to the Road to Ruin budget that ends Medicare with the highest amongst those being senior citizens, at 74% opposed to the plan. In addition, the voters in the 26th Congressional District of New York recently made their voices heard when they elected Representative Kathy Hochul to be the newest member of Congress. Their top concern was that the Republican budget threatens to end Medicare. They know that under their plan, anyone under the age of 55 will be forced to save an extra $182,000 just to pay for their future health care costs and retirements. That number rises to a startling $400,000 for those in their 30s. These statistics are even more astounding when you consider the billions of dollars in tax breaks Republicans have given away to our country's wealthiest individuals as well as big oil companies. Enough is enough. If Republicans are serious about protecting our nation's seniors, they would work with us to strengthen Medicare, not end it. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Republicans are doubling down on their plan to end Medicare, voting this week for a second time on their Road to Ruin budget that ends Medicare. Republicans instead should listen to the will of the people who overwhelmingly oppose their Medicare plans and instead work in a bipartisan way to address deficits and strengthen Medicare. The Republican budget more than doubles costs for future generations and puts insurance companies back in charge. According to the CBO, in 2022, the average senior will see their costs increase by more than $6,000. And the Republican budget also cuts benefits for today's seniors. It reopens the prescription drug donut hole, increasing costs for the estimated 4 million seniors who fall into the coverage gap by as much as $44 billion over the next decade, including $2.2 billion in 2012 alone. It also increases costs for preventive care and eliminates the annual wellness benefit. The Republican budget has the wrong priorities and makes the wrong choices for seniors and middle-class families.
He's already used the 1 minute. We ready? For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by the direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 294 and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 44, House Resolution 294. Resolved, that upon the adoption of this resolution it shall be in order without intervention of any point of order to consider in the House the resolution, House Resolution 292, declaring that the President shall not deploy, establish, or maintain the presence of units and members of the United States Armed Forces on the ground in Libya and for other purposes. The resolution shall be considered as read. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the resolution to its adoption without intervening motion or demand for division of the question except 1 hour of debate, with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services. Section 2. Upon the adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order without intervention of any point of order to consider in the House the concurrent resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 51, directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to remove the United States Armed Forces from Libya if called up by the Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs or her designee. The concurrent resolution shall be considered as read. The concurrent resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, with 30 minutes controlled by Representative Ross Layton of Florida or her designee, and 30 minutes controlled by Representative Kucinich of Ohio or his designee. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the concurrent resolution to its adoption without intervening motion.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, sir. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks. House Resolution 294 provides for a closed rule for consideration of 2 measures, House Concurrent Resolution 51 and House Resolution 292.
Gentleman is recognized.
This rule allows for the consideration of House Concurrent Resolution 51 consistent with the War Powers Act and provides for an alternative measure introduced by the Speaker of the House. I support the Speaker's resolution and the ability to have up or down votes on both resolutions. This approach is consistent with the Speaker's and our conference's goal of a more open and transparent process, allowing the House to work its will on both resolutions. Members can vote for one of the resolutions, both of the resolutions, or neither of them. The underlying legislation addresses the administration's actions in Libya. Mr. Speaker, on March 19, 2011, President Obama ordered U.S. military intervention in Libya as a part of a multinational coalition. Well, over 60 days later, let me say that one more time, over 60 days later, the President has still not asked for, nor has he received, authorization from Congress to commit troops to such action. Mr. Speaker, Article 1 of our Constitution states that Congress, and only Congress, has the power to declare war. This point was made best in 2007 by then Senator Barack Obama, who said, and I quote, "The President does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." Just in case we missed that, the current President got it right in 2007 when he was a senator. I want to quote him one more time. He said that the President does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. While the United States must play offense in the war on terror, and we should not have to wait for threats to materialize before acting, it is not clear, it is simply not clear that Libya posed a threat to our nation that justified the use of troops, the United States troops. It is undeniable that Gaddafi is one of the most notorious terrorists of our time, and the world will be a better place when he is gone. But at the same time, there is no shortage of dictators who should be removed from power. Syria's Assad is butchering his own people as we speak. Iran, under Ahmadinejad, sponsors terrorism around the world. He persecutes religious minorities and is working to develop a nuclear bomb. Moreover, the President has not outlined the purpose or the scope of our action in Libya. Is the objective the removal of Gaddafi from power? If so, who will replace Gaddafi? And what assurances do the American people have that the alternative will be any better than Gaddafi? House Resolution 292 accomplishes 4 objectives. First, it establishes that the President of the United States, President Obama, has not asked for congressional authorization for a military involvement in Libya, and that Congress has not granted such authority. Second, the resolution reasserts that Congress has the option to withhold funding for any unauthorized use of the United States Armed Forces, including such activities in Libya. Third, the resolution requires the President to provide within 14 days information to Congress which should have been provided from the start. Fourth, the resolution reaffirms the vote that Congress took just last week that says that there should be no U.S. troops on the ground in Libya unless they're there to rescue American troops. It is unfortunate, it is very unfortunate that our President has made this resolution necessary. Yet, at the same time, we are mindful that the congressional action must consider our responsibilities to our allies, including those that are currently in harm's way. America keeps its promises. We keep our commitments, and we stand by our soldiers and our allies. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague from South Carolina for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, last week the House spoke quite clearly on the question of Libya during the debate on the FY 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. By a vote of 415 to 5 on a bipartisan amendment offered by Congressman Conyers, the House voted against U.S. deploying ground troops in Libya. So the House has clearly stated its position on U.S. military operations in Libya. But that vote did not touch upon 2 serious matters, each very much connected to the other. First is the fact that the President did not seek a congressional authorization for U.S. military engagement in Libya in coordination with our NATO allies, nor did the leadership of this House insist on one or pursue one. Second, under the War Powers Resolution, the President has not sought the authorization of Congress during the required time period to maintain U.S. armed forces in military operations in Libya. Simply put, under the War Powers Resolution, the President must obtain congressional authorization for military action that lasts longer than 60 days. If Congress does not authorize military action, the President must withdraw troops within 30 days. The 60-day authorization deadline expired on May 20, and the 30-day withdrawal deadline expires on June 19th. Therefore, the Congress now has the responsibility to call for the end of U.S. military operations in the absence of a clearly defined authorization for U.S. military operations in Libya. Last night, Mr. Speaker, the Rules Committee considered 2 resolutions, one offered by Representatives Kucinich, Burton, and Capuano, which clearly addresses the violation of the War Powers Resolution and would require the withdrawal of U.S. forces from military operations in Libya. If passed by the House and the Senate, it would have the force of law. The other, offered by the Speaker of the House, is a simple H-Res, a non-binding resolution, a document which is simply advisory in nature and relevant only as a statement of the House, which reprimands the President for failing to seek proper authorization for our military operations in Libya, asks for reports to provide the House with necessary information regarding national security interests and costs of the Libya operation, and then does nothing. Nothing, Mr. Speaker. It again shirks the responsibility of this House and this Congress as a whole to either take up and pass an authorization for U.S. military operations in Libya or pass a resolution requiring a withdrawal of U.S. forces and an end to U.S. military operations in Libya. Mr. Speaker, it's easy to complain. It's easy to lay blame. But it takes leadership to own up to our own responsibilities and take appropriate action. And it takes leadership to handle this process in a responsible way. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, this process does not do that. The Republican leadership rushed their resolution through the Rules Committee without any hearings and without any markup, violating their 3-day pledge to allow people to read the bill. So much for the new open House of Representatives. This would be sad, Mr. Speaker, if it weren't so important. War is a serious issue. Whether we are sending unmanned drones, armed jets, or American soldiers into harm's way, war must be debated and considered by the Congress in a responsible manner. The Republican leadership, however, is not treating this issue the way it deserves to be treated. This debate deserves better, quite frankly. The American people deserve better. I urge my colleagues to defeat this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just one clarification. The concurrent Resolution 51 does not become law. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina. Make that 3 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm honored to be here with the newly elected freshman member of the 1st District of South Carolina, Tim Scott. I appreciate his leadership on the Rules Committee. The people of South Carolina are very proud of his service. The people of the 1st District of South Carolina are noted for their strong support of the military, and they elect members to Congress like Tim Scott who work for a strong military, a strong national defense in the tradition of Ronald Reagan, of peace through strength. In the 1st District, the congressman has the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, the Charleston Air Force Base, the Naval Weapons Station, Spey Wars. In fact, I actually grew up there adjacent to U.S. Coast Guard base. So we know the value of a strong military. Personally, in fact, Congressman Scott's brother was the Command Sergeant Major at Landstuhl, one of the largest military hospitals in the world, in Germany. So his Army experience and family connection, we know that Tim Scott is for a strong military and understand, as I do, how important it is that military force should only be used when it is in America's vital interest. I have the perspective of being the son of a World War II veteran, a Flying Tiger. I served 31 years in the Army National Guard. I have 4 sons currently serving in the military. I want our military to be used properly. When the President's right, as he was, to follow the advice of General David Petraeus, to add troops, the surge in Afghanistan, the resulting success that we see in Afghanistan today, when the President is right, we're happy to support him. But this resolution is very important because we have not seen from the President of the United States, there has been a failure of leadership in regard to explaining why military forces are being used in Libya. I'm very pleased with the resolution. The key point that the American people need to know is declaring that the President shall not deploy, establish, or maintain the presence of units and members of the United States Armed Forces on the ground in Libya. To put troops on the ground, I believe, is highly irresponsible. A case has not been made of why this is in America's vital interest. We know there is great conflict as to who the rebels are. What are these rebels? Are these al-Qaeda elements that are attacking the Gaddafi forces themselves? What would happen if we got involved with troops on the ground? These issues need to be resolved on behalf of the American military, on behalf of the American people, and we urge through this resolution that the answers be provided to the American people, to the American military, to our allies. Why are we there? What is America's vital interest? And so I urge support of the rule and commend the freshman congressman from South Carolina for his leadership.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself so much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Again, just so we're all clear here, under the War Powers Act, if a concurrent resolution is passed demanding that the troops are removed from a particular country, then they will be removed. You believe that the War Powers Act carries any weight. And I believe that the War Powers Act is relevant here. That's what the resolution by Mr. Kucinich does. What the resolution my friends in the Republican leadership have drafted does is nothing. Your resolution doesn't even have to go to the Senate. It won't go to the Senate. It directs the President to do a whole bunch of things that, quite frankly, he can ignore because this bill doesn't mean anything. What this is, and let's be clear about what this is a way from some of my friends on the other side of the aisle to kind of cover their backsides, to be able to say to their constituents, we did something tough on Libya. Let me read to you how tough the language is in the bill that the Speaker of the House has drawn up. A lot of tough language. Sounds good, except when you look a little bit more closely, you realize that this is an H-res, which doesn't mean a thing. So if you're into symbolism, if you're into therapy, you know, vote for the Boehner resolution. If you are interested in action, if you are interested in actually living up to our responsibilities as lawmakers in the United States Congress, then I would suggest that you look at the resolution that Mr. Kucinich has drafted. So you can talk all you want about how this is the Republican alternative here is somehow meaningful, but it really isn't. But again, I shouldn't be surprised, no one should be surprised here, because most of what they have done since they assumed control of the Congress has been meaningless, has been symbolic, whether it's dealing with health care or jobs, which they don't want to talk about, or you name it. A lot of it has been mostly symbolic. And I think on the issue of war, we should take it more seriously and be more honest with the American people as to what we're doing. At this point, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, what we're confronted with today is not primarily a question of foreign policy or even of war policy. We are presented with a question of constitutional law and of the prerogatives of the United States Congress. Shall the President, like the King of England, be a dictator in foreign policy? Shall the President have the unfettered right to take this country to war without so much as a by your leave from Congress, as the King of England could do without authorization from Parliament? The authors of our Constitution answered that question in the negative. And they said, no, we don't trust kings, we don't trust executives to make the decision to go to war. We want that to be the prerogative of the people as represented by the Congress. A whole series of presidents since World War II have forgotten that, starting with Harry Truman and the Korean War and Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War right up to the present. Now, there are reasons for this, and I'll go into that when I speak on the Kucinich resolution a little later. I would simply observe now, I'm going to vote for the Boehner resolution. But I'm also going to vote for the Kucinich resolution. The Boehner resolution is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't deal with the basic problem. The Boehner resolution says the President has failed to provide Congress with a compelling rationale based upon U.S. security interests for current United States military activities. That is true. And frankly, I do not understand why we are in Libya. The Boehner resolution then says the President shall transmit to the House of Representatives all kinds of information basically saying why we're there. And that's good. You should have done that before we went there, but it's good that we demand this information now. But then the Boehner resolution stops. All it demands of the President is that he give us his reasons. And his reasons, maybe we'll agree with them, maybe we won't. Maybe they're sufficient, and maybe they're not. And then it says findings. The President has not sought and Congress has not provided authorization for the introduction or continued involvement of the United States Armed Forces in Libya. That's true. And Congress has the constitutional prerogative to withhold fund. Can I have another minute?
Yield the gentleman additional 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Congress has the constitutional prerogative to withhold funding for any unauthorized use of the U.S. Armed Forces, including for unauthorized activities regarding Libya. That's also true. But so what? It doesn't direct anything. It doesn't say that what the President did was outside his powers. It doesn't direct that the activity stop. It doesn't do anything. And I think we should do something. Because if in this situation we do not reclaim congressional powers, I can think of no set of circumstances under which the President cannot go to war without going to Congress first. No set of circumstances, and that turns the Constitution and the intentions of our framers and the intentions of our whole constitutional law system on its head. Therefore, I urge a vote of yes on the Boehner resolution and a vote of yes on the Kucinich resolution, which, unlike the Boehner resolution, actually does something about the situation we find ourselves in. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Denham.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. You know, this could not be any more serious. It's important for us to debate what our service members are doing in foreign conflicts. And the War Power Act, it is important to make sure that the President understands from Congress exactly what we are willing to do with our American troops and where we're willing to fight. But I do agree. He has to give us his reasons. In Desert Storm, we knew why we were there. We knew what our role was. We knew what our goals were. We knew what our exit strategy was. These are the very reasons that we're looking for before we appropriate funds, before we put our troops at risk, before any boots go to the ground, before this conflict escalates any further, before a new government comes into play. We expect these answers to be given to us. We expect the President to do his job, to show leadership, to address Congress and explain why he is committing American service members. So this is very serious. It is a very serious and it's long overdue. The President should have came here first. He certainly should have came here within 60 days. It is long overdue. It is very serious. And the time to demand answers is now. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, let me yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
I hear a lot of talk on the other side about, that the Boehner resolution requires the President to do this, it directs him to do that, he must do this, he shall do this. But the way you have presented this in this H-Res form, the President doesn't have to do anything. So let's not fool ourselves and let's not fool the American people that somehow this is meaningful. At this point, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes. The gentlelady is recognized.
This could be no more a somber debate than what we are doing here today, and I thank the manager, Ms. McGovern, gentleman from South Carolina, for recognizing through the leadership of our House that the American people must be engaged in the constitutional duties that have been set out for the three branches of government. Under the Constitution, the war powers are divided between Congress and the President, and among other relevant grants, Congress has the power to declare war and raise and support armed forces, while the President is the Commander-in-Chief. The congressional duties fall under Article 1, Section 8, and the Commander-in-Chief can relate his or her duties to Article 2, Section 2. It is generally agreed that the Commander-in-Chief role gives the President power to utilize the armed forces to repel attacks against the United States, but there has long been a challenge, a controversy, over whether he or she is constitutionally authorized to send forces into hostile situations abroad without a declaration of war or congressional authorization. And so here we are today, indicating that it is important for the Commander-in-Chief, no matter how much respect there is, to be able to respond to the call of the Congress. There is now 2 resolutions that swirl around the violence and horrific acts in Libya. Compounding the problem is the continued violence and assault on the people of Libya. So for a moment, let me focus on General Gaddafi to ask him the question, is he reasoned and does he recognize that the slaughter of his people must stop? The President of South Africa engaged in peace talks with General Gaddafi, and many of us thought that the white flag would be raised and that there would be an opportunity for resolution. We see that not coming. So my message to General Gaddafi is to stop this senseless and violent war, to allow your people to accumulate the privileges of human dignity, that is to be able to live in peace and hopefully to secure democratic rights for themselves. But at the same time, we in the United States cannot stand by and watch as violence proceeds. We must have procedure. We must have process. I believe the Boehner Amendment gives at least some tracking as to what you're asking the President for. But I still quarrel with the debate and the question as to whether or not that is enough. I am supporting this rule so that we can move forward to begin to debate this question of the War Powers Resolution. And it is important that the branches of government understand you cannot roll over the Constitution. The Constitution does not allow us to ignore the Supreme Court's decision. It does not allow us, I have additional 30 seconds. It does not allow us, in essence, to ignore the responsibilities of Congress. So I rise today to support this debate and to support the premise that Congress must declare war. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of our committee, Chairman Dreyer.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection, gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend for yielding and congratulate him on his management of this extraordinarily important rule. I want to begin by saying that I listened to my friend from Worcester. I was upstairs, and I want to express my appreciation to him for his very sincere institutional commitment, his commitment to our recognizing the preeminence of the first branch of government, and the fact that we, Mr. Kucinich, Mr. Boehner, and all of us, Democrat and Republican alike, recognize that the President of the United States, under Article 2 and Article 1, has the responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to, in fact, engage the United States Congress. Now, I think that a little clarification may need to be made at this juncture, because as I listen to the debate, there seems to be quite a bit of confusion. People often talk about the War Powers Act. Mr. Speaker, there is no such thing as the War Powers Act. There was a War Powers Resolution that passed that does not have the power and the strength of an enacted law. Similarly, Mr. Kucinich's resolution, which we will be considering, and this rule makes an order, is a measure that will not have the force of law. Yes, it is true that it is an H. con res, meaning that it will be considered in the Senate as well, assuming it passes this House, but it does not have the force of law. And no one, Mr. Speaker, should try to make that claim. Similarly, the H. res that Mr. Boehner has offered, which I personally believe is more responsible, because the notion of our calling for withdrawal within 2 weeks is something that virtually everyone has said cannot be done. That's why I believe that Mr. Boehner's resolution is a more responsible one than the one offered by my good friend from Ohio. But it, too, does not have the force of law. So as we proceed with this debate, I think it's very important for us to recognize that the terms that are being used need to be used correctly. And I thank my friend for yielding.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, let me yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Just again, since we want to make sure everybody's got the right terminology correct and we're clarifying the record, the H-res that Mr. Boehner has introduced, that my friends on the Republican side are touting as something substantial, gives the appearance of doing something, when in reality it does nothing.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield the gentleman for 15 seconds.
I thank my friend for yielding. Let me just say that the characterization that my friend just made of Mr. Boehner's resolution would also have to apply to the resolution offered by our friend from Ohio. We're talking about resolutions here. We're not talking about measures that have the power of law. Well, this is not an act. These are resolutions which are statements being made by this institution.
Mr. Speaker, regular order.
Claims his time.
I'm sorry that the gentleman has such a low opinion of the War Powers Resolution, but I think it carries more weight than he does. But I would again say to my colleagues that what Mr. Boehner has proposed here has all this tough language in it, requiring the President to do this, directing the President to do that, when in fact, if we pass this, the President is under the obligation to do nothing. At this point, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because the Constitution vests the authority to declare war in the Congress, I oppose the administration's decision to dispatch American troops into hostilities in Libya without coming here first. I think that was an error. But because I take those constitutional obligations very seriously, and because each of us should take them very seriously, I oppose this rule and the underlying resolution from Speaker Boehner. I find it ironic that at a time when the institution is trying to assert its rightful constitutional place, that the Speaker has proposed a resolution which is wholly ineffective and purely symbolic. This resolution pursues a gravely important objective in a rather frivolous and ineffective way. If we believe that the conduct of a military operation is inappropriate for the country, there are tools available to us under the Constitution. Each one of those tools, whether it involves ceasing appropriations or it involves other sorts of remedies, requires the consent of both the House and the Senate. To be effective, we must be bicameral. And to be bicameral, we have to put a resolution on the floor, the passage of which would lead to consideration by the Senate. The Boehner resolution, by its own terms, does not do that. So the question the members ought to be asking themselves here, whether they're for or against the incursion in Libya, whether they think it should cease or continue, is what is the effect of passing the Boehner resolution? As a practical and legal matter, the effect is nothing. Nothing. All of the items the President would be directed to do, any of the steps the President would be prohibited from taking, are meaningless if the Boehner resolution passes, because the Boehner resolution does not contemplate being considered by the Senate. So I would offer this to members, that if they are looking for a resolution that in fact has effect and meaning, Mr. Kucinich's resolution has real effect and meaning, because it is a due exercise of the constitutional authority of the Congress. The Speaker's resolution, which I take certainly in good faith, has none of that effectiveness and none of that practical consequence. So I would urge a no vote on the rule precisely because of the principle of congressional authority. If you believe that we should exercise our constitutional authority, then let's really exercise it. Let's put something before the body that has real and practical meaning. I would urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our friends on the left continue to call House resolutions frivolous and meaningless. My good friend, Mr. McGovern, himself just last term had House Resolutions 278 on Global Security Priorities Resolution. The fact of the matter is the House needs to position themselves so the American people understands what this House is trying to convey to the President of the United States. The fact of the matter is this President continues to do things that, as a senator, he said was inconsistent with the Constitution. So we are making sure that this House and the people who voted in this House are represented in the public forum. I yield, Mr. Speaker, 3 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection, gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about our Constitution and the specific role that it grants this Congress. My constituents back in the 3rd Congressional District of South Carolina know that I carry the United States Constitution with me every day. And the first time I spoke on this floor, it was to read a portion of this great document. Specifically, I read the article that we're talking about today, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, the enumerated power of Congress and the Congress alone to declare war. Our founders did not give that right to the executive branch. They invested that responsibility with us. Now, previous Congresses have delegated some of that responsibility with the War Powers Resolution. That's what's being used by this President. But I think that as time has come for us to have the debate about the wisdom of that and the constitutional obligation our founders defined for Congress. Over the past few years, our country has seen a renewed appreciation for the Constitution, a recognition of the wisdom and divine guidance our founding fathers had when they crafted this sacred document. The Constitution lists our rights, these rights which were given us directly by God, but also contains mechanisms to protect our rights from being trampled upon by man. Among the most important of these protections is the separation of powers. Seeing firsthand the tyranny that can arise from a corrupt, centralized power, our founding fathers sought to divide that power, to divide the power of government into three independent branches that serves as checks on one another. Mr. Speaker, we in the Congress need to know, what is the national interest at stake in Libya? The President cites humanitarian needs, regional stability, supporting the international community as his justification. I do not believe that these reasons suffice as national security interests. We did not go into Libya with a clear, obtainable objective. The risk and cost do not appear to be fully analyzed. As the President said, we would only be in Libya for days, not months. We've been there days, as a matter of fact. We've been there 73 days. 73 days after we've gotten involved, and we still don't have that answer. We don't know who we're supporting. We don't know whether we have a viable end game. We don't have a congressional declaration of war or an authorization of force. And yet this President chooses to continue to risk American lives, American servicemen and women. He continues to spend that American treasure at the whims of the United Nations. This President should not be able to simply have wars of choice. He said this action in Libya would be limited. Our troops have, once again, as always, performed admirably and done the job the President gave them to do, but we now have to do ours. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution is very clear. Only Congress has the power to declare war. If this Congress allows our President to make wars of choice without the rule of law to guide him, we will be just as guilty in not upholding our constitutional obligations. I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, let me yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
My colleague, Mr. Scott, talked about the fact that I've supported House resolutions in the past, and that therefore, that we should have more respect for the document that Mr. Boehner has put together. I have no problem with H-Reses. I mean, they state where they state the views and the beliefs of members of the House of Representatives. But what I have a problem with is anybody coming to the floor and holding up the Boehner resolution and saying it does something that it does not. What the Boehner resolution simply does is it just expresses the view of Congress. Doesn't require, even though it said pretty strong words in here, it doesn't require the President to do anything. He doesn't have to do anything if this thing passes. The other thing I want to say, again, going back, the distinguished chairman of the Rules Committee came on the floor here and just kind of poo-pooed the War Powers Resolution as if it were just some other mere resolution. Quite frankly, I'm stunned by his characterization. I think it's astonishing to me that he would come on the floor and say such a thing. The fact of the matter is the War Powers Resolution is a joint resolution of Congress passed by the House and the Senate. It was vetoed, and then it was overridden. It has the power of law. It is not just a mere resolution. So let's not put this on the same level as what the Speaker of the House has brought to this floor. They're two different things. And what Mr. Kucinich does is he responds to the obligations that Congress has under the War Powers Resolution. This is serious stuff. This is important stuff. And if we're going to get our terminology straight, we ought to get it straight. And with that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, member of the Armed Services Committee.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rushed, hyper-partisan process that we're watching today on a very serious issue of war resolution. It is absolutely a given that Congress has a role to play in terms of the President's action, that it should be scrutinized, and that we should have the opportunity to weigh in on it. And our Armed Services Committee has been meeting on a regular basis, holding administration officials' feet to the fire on those very questions. We had one yesterday. The fact of the matter is, though, just because Congress has that right to weigh in doesn't mean that we should pass a resolution for a resolution's sake. The batting average of Congress in terms of rushed resolutions, frankly, folks, is not very good. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was rushed through the Congress, and we know now today that historians have uncovered the fact that misinformation was presented to the Congress. The Iraq War resolution in 2002 was rushed through this Congress with bad information, and we are now seeing today language which was drafted literally overnight being presented to the members of this body and being asked to weigh in on a deliberative fashion. This is a polemic we are voting on. This is not a carefully balanced, bipartisan process which the people of this country and the people who wear the uniform of this country deserve. If you read the statement of policy, it is devoid of any of the lead-up to the President's decision, which included a resolution by the Arab League on March 12th to impose a no-fly zone, the UN Security Council on March 17th to impose a no-fly zone, and on March 1st, the United States Senate voted unanimously, not 51%, not 81%, not 91%, 100% in support of a no-fly zone, a Republican and Democratic bipartisan resolution calling on the President to do exactly what he's doing today. Now, again, there is no question 70 days is a long time. 30 seconds.
Additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is longer than certainly it was originally presented to this Congress. But the fact of the matter is this resolution, which was drafted in a partisan fashion, is so disappointing to the people who care so profoundly about whether or not the decisions on war and peace are actually going to be deliberated, debated, and voted on in a serious fashion, are left with this truncated process that is, again, almost an insult to the people of this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When you look at what we're doing here today, the gentleman to the left got it wrong. Bottom line is that members of the House of Representatives have a choice. They can do one of two or three things. They can vote for House Resolution 292, or they can vote for Concurrent Resolution 51. They can do both, or they can do neither. The fact of the matter is to trivialize or to belittle the process that we are undertaking on behalf of the American people ought to give us cause to pause and ask ourselves, who is playing the games? We want the President of the United States to abide by the Constitution. You've heard Democrats and Republicans agree this morning on one clear fact. He didn't. And that's why we are here. I yield, Mr. Speaker, 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Dr. Fox.
Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from South Carolina for yielding time. And I want to say from the very beginning that Mr. McGovern and I don't often agree on issues, but we do agree that this is a very serious issue that we're dealing with today. And yesterday in the Rules Committee, all of us dealt with this in a very serious way. Mr. Speaker, we live in the greatest country in the world. A major part of what makes us so great is that we are a nation of laws and not of men, and our rule of law is based on God's laws and our Constitution. Indeed, each one of us in Congress takes an oath to uphold the Constitution when we take our office. The President and Vice President, as well as members of the Cabinet, do the same thing. We're here today to debate a rule and two resolutions related to the inattention of the President to the Constitution. And I dare say that none of us takes any joy in this, but we feel compelled by our dedication to our founding document to do this because we love our country. By doing all that we can to safeguard the constitutional powers granted to Congress, we are doing our part to keep the United States great and strong. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear about what is not at issue today. This debate is not about our troops. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to our men and women in the military and their families. The troops do what they are sworn to do, what the law requires them to do, obey the orders of the Commander-in-Chief. The troops are doing their duty. By refusing to get congressional authorization for military action in Libya, it appears that their Commander-in-Chief is not. The Constitution was designed to be a check on the power of our government, hence the term enumerated powers. Each of the three branches has very limited powers, with Congress having its own unique role and powers, one of which, an important one of which, is the power to declare war. My focus this morning will be on the abrogation of the constitutional and statutory responsibility by the President in regard to his actions on Libya. In other words, the authorization to use military force is given to the President by this body and none other. And it is in accordance with our Constitution that we are here, asserting our sworn constitutional duty and telling the President he does not have the support nor the authority that he claims to have in order to continue military operations in Libya. I've often urged people to read Orwell's book, 1984, because the language used by President Obama in particular on the Libya issue to muddy the waters is so reminiscent of the language used in that book about a country where the government controls everything, including the minds of the people, partly by the use of language that is completely distorted. Mr. Speaker, I've read the letter that President Obama sent to Congress. He should have come in person to make his case, but even then I doubt that we would agree to continue operations in Libya. The letter that the President sent us does not even begin to comply with the requirements of the War Powers Act. Let me read parts of it and enter the entire letter into the record, Mr. Speaker. Here's how the letter begins. On March 21, I reported to Congress that the United States, pursuant to a request from the Arab League and authorization by the United Nations Security Council, had acted 2 days earlier to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe by deploying U.S. forces to protect the people of Libya from the Gaddafi regime. As you know, over these last 2 months, the U.S. role in this operation to support the Security Resolution 1973 has become more limited, yet remains important. Here's where I want to get into this convoluted language. Thus, pursuant to our ongoing consultations, I wish to express my support for the bipartisan resolution drafted by Senators Kerry, McCain, Levin, Feinstein, Graham, and Lieberman, which would confirm that the Congress supports the U.S. mission in Libya and that both branches are united in their commitment to supporting the aspirations of the Libyan people for political reform and self-government. Mr. Speaker, this is double-speak. A resolution drafted, never introduced or passed, which would confirm that Congress supports the U.S. mission. The President is dreaming when he talks about this language. Mr. Speaker, could I have 30 seconds?
30 seconds, yes, ma'am.
Gentlelady is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me reiterate. This debate is not about our troops, it's about our Constitution. Our men and women in uniform are doing their duty by following orders. They make me and the rest of us very proud. We're a blessed nation to have such men and women in the military. Mr. Speaker, this is about our oath to protect and defend the Constitution, about the checks and balances our founding fathers had in mind when they broke away from an imperial monarchy. I urge my colleagues to support the rule, and I yield the balance of my time.
The lady's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentlelady from North Carolina for her remarks, much of which I agree with, and I don't always agree with her. But I especially appreciate her emphasis on the importance of the War Powers Resolution and how it applies here. And I, again, want to emphasize the importance of the War Powers Resolution because I was, again, really surprised by the way the distinguished chairman of the Rules Committee kind of diminished what the War Powers Resolution is all about. I want to read to you, read to my colleagues, a section from a briefing paper that the Congressional Research Service has put together. Let me just read this part here. Section 1 establishes the title, the War Powers Resolution. The law is frequently referred to as the War Powers Act, the title of the measure passed by the Senate. Although the latter is not technically correct, it does serve to emphasize that the War Powers Resolution, embodied in a joint resolution which complies with constitutional requirements for lawmaking, is a law. And again, what I find puzzling is that we're all talking about the importance of the War Powers Resolution, and my friends on the other side of the aisle are saying, well, that's why you need to support the Boehner H-Res, which, again, does nothing. I mean, we could do a press release, and it would have the same impact that the resolution that Mr. Boehner has introduced would have on the President of the United States and on forcing the President of the United States to do certain things. So I want to again emphasize that there is a War Powers Resolution. It is law. And it is important that we understand that, and we have a role in that. And what Mr. Kucinich is trying to do is to assert the proper congressional role with regard to the War Powers Resolution. What my friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to do, again, is, I guess, either provide cover for members so they don't have to vote for Mr. Kucinich, or, or to make a statement, but it doesn't really do anything. With that, I reserve my balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman